Good evening and welcome to you all. Welcome to another London lecture in this centenary series of London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Now, it would be natural enough to say that our guest this evening needs no introduction, but that would be terribly unfair. Everybody needs an introduction. Rowan Williams has had careers both as a clergyman and as a theologian. He was, of course, Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 to 2012 and an active crossbench member of the House of Lords from 2013 to 2020. As an academic, he's been a Gifford lecturer, he's been Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity in Oxford, and among his many honours, he has a Doctorate of Divinity and a Fellowship of the British Academy. Most recently, he's been Master of Magdalene College in Cambridge. By my reckoning, his bibliography numbers 52 books, I may have miscounted, including not only works of theology, works on St. Augustine, but also works on Dostoevsky, Narnia, and some works of his own poetry. And his new book, Solidarity, the Work of Recognition, is due out in the new year. Rowan, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Over to you. Thank you.
I'm very grateful indeed for the invitation to be with you and for that kind introduction. An opportunity not just to advertise the new book, though while I'm on the subject, I suppose I might as well, but to reflect on one of the sets of problems that, as you might say, got me going with writing this book about solidarity. The trigger for writing was really, in large part, a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy by the distinguished neuroscientist Simon Baron-Cohen. Baron-Cohen has done a lot of work on empathy circuits in the brain, some groundbreaking work on the nature of autistic conditions, and in this book he attempts to relate questions around empathy to the fundamentals of ethics. He says at one point, ambitiously, that every problem becomes soluble when immersed in empathy. When I read that, I knew I had to find out exactly why it was wrong. And so part of what you're hearing tonight is the result of that question. Baron-Cohen speaks about the lack of empathy, or empathy deficit, in terms of the human propensity to treat other subjects as objects. And he gives some examples of this, which, to my mind, prove something very different from what he thinks they prove. He speaks about an atrocity committed in a civil war in Central Africa. A female militia commander ordering women in a captured village to kill their children. How terrible. What a lack of empathy that displays. And my response was to say that is not a lack of empathy. On the contrary, it shows a very acute understanding of just exactly what the emotional effect of certain things is on other persons. It is bizarrely to treat others as subjects in a very intense way, as a result of a deep imaginative awareness of what their condition is and what their likely reactions are. Later on in the book, Baron-Cohen speaks poignantly, as it now seems, speaks about the way in which in the Middle East, an Israeli father and a Palestinian father who have both lost children in the conflict will understand one another's grief and be reconciled in their common fragility and loss. To which one can only say there's been a certain amount of opportunity for that to happen, and the number of instances where that has happened is vanishingly small, and it makes very little impact on a situation where the constraints and causes behind murderous conflict are so much more complex than just histories of individual trauma. Now, Baron-Cohen is only one example of a trend which I think has been quite widespread in discussion in perhaps the last couple of decades. A trend which has, in many ways, privileged and foregrounded the notion of empathy as a key concept in understanding what people ought to grow into as ethical subjects and ethical agents. President Obama made a comment to that effect in one of his public utterances. Many more popular works have developed that, and some have gone so far as to publish books with titles like Adventures in Empathy. The point being that it seems like a plausible and practical approach to what seem to be intractable ethical problems. The real issue is that none of us fully understands what other people are feeling. If we are more capable of understanding what strangers are feeling, we are less likely to do terrible things to them. This is, of course, surrounded not only by some of the problems I've already flagged, but by a couple of really rather fundamental, practical and conceptual difficulties. To talk about understanding another may all too readily be seen as a way of absorbing the other's otherness into my own self-referential story. "I know how you feel" is not a phrase many of us really like to hear. And I always have in mind here the immortal Sybil Fawlty, Fawlty Towers on the telephone, saying, "Oh, I know," several times. "Oh, I know" is not, I think, empathy in a very interesting sense. What often we mistake for the empathic, or misdefine in terms of the empathic, is really an intense awareness of how I would feel if I were in that situation, which is not quite the same thing as understanding what another feels in their situation. And to say that that's what it boils down to is really to dissolve the essential impenetrability of speaker to speaker in ordinary human intercourse. A strange thing to say, perhaps, but I'll come back to that a bit later. But it is, to my mind, essential that if we are to understand the ongoing, exploratory, surprising, and creative dimensions of human language, we must implicitly understand that any specific act of communication is not an act of unmediated, direct awareness of the content of another subject, another consciousness. So, Baron Cohen's panacea for ethical difficulties seems fraught with all kinds of problems, practical and conceptual. It veers dangerously towards the notion that it's possible for me as a subject so to encompass the content and tone of another consciousness that I will be fully aware of what the other feels, but remain myself. In other words, the specific, unique location of a state of suffering in another person's history, another person's development, matters not at all. There is a content, a suffering content, let's say, which I can encompass and make my own. Many years ago, I remember hearing a well-meaning theologian from Latin America, I think. No, I tell a lie, from Germany. From Germany. But talking about Latin American writers, saying that it was very important for theologians from the developed world, I quote, to borrow the experience of the poor. And my first reaction was to think, the poor have little enough as it is, but if what they have is being borrowed by rather well-paid German academics, their difficulties are even more than they thought. that risk of, as it were, colonizing, appropriating, absorbing the otherness of another's experience in the name of empathy is, I think, one of the difficulties that constantly comes back to haunt this complex discussion. And I was intrigued to see a recent short work which dealt with precisely this question. Aruna de Souza, writing on this subject, who notes that what very often we need in ethical interaction, not to say political action, is not a claim for the total transparency of the suffering of the other to myself, but what you might call a good enough understanding, which allows common work, common conversation to flourish. She contrasts, in that respect, the ideal of love with the ideal of care, saying in a rather counterintuitive way that the problem is love. We idealize or mythologize states of love, and we talk, sometimes rather glibly, about unconditional love as an ideal ethical state, whereas, she says, what we ought to be focusing on is care. Care is not connected with what I seek to get out of this for myself, but about the practical task of addressing what is in front of me and listening to the experience of whoever is in front of me, rather than assuming that I already know and there's nothing to learn. Which relates to another much less technical treatment of the subject in some of the remarkable essays by the American writer Leslie Jameson, who in her book The Empathy Exams says that sometimes I care about your pain is another way of saying I care if you like me. Running through all of this discussion is that unease about whether we call it love or care, and I would argue with de Souza a little bit about her categories, whether we call it love or care. Are we in fact talking about our own experience of encountering another's experience and absorbing it into our narrative, or are we actually engaging with what we cannot script, control, or manage for ourselves? Inevitably, the emphasis on empathy as a foundation stone of ethics has brought its own reactions. Paul Bloom in the United States, again, has written a powerful book called Against Empathy. And we've heard from some quite senior figures around the current United States administration about how bad a thing empathy is because it makes us too soft. Paul Bloom's critique is the more interesting of the two, and it addresses the way in which a certain kind of rhetoric about empathy so privileges how we are feeling in response to atrocity, to suffering and need, that it becomes very difficult indeed for us as subjects, for anyone, to calibrate what an appropriate response is. Bloom says, a campaign to raise money for starving children in Africa is always going to be more attractive because more emotionally immediate than a campaign, let's say, for universal literacy for women in Africa. And yet, addressing the problem of universal literacy for women in Africa arguably will save more lives than a campaign directed to the often rather blunt instrument of a certain kind of aid delivery aimed at the most obvious and most emotionally heartstring-pulling sufferings. How do you cope with that, says Bloom, in a society and culture which is increasingly dominated by highly sentimental and short-term responses to crisis, internal and external? Jameson, in one of her essays in the collection I just mentioned, uses the powerful and interesting phrase, the opacity at the core of bodily experience. Part of what she's directing our attention to in the essays in this very interesting book is that opacity. As I've said already, there is no learning, there is no self-interrogation or other interrogation if we always already know or are able to know without mediation what is being felt by another. But what if the very fact of our embodied character creates a perfectly proper, irreducible opaqueness to one another? What if the structures of our human relation, the connections of language and symbol making, are bound up with the fact that we are not immediate to one another, that we construct meanings in the shared material labour of society? You kindly mentioned the book, and I mentioned it myself. The subtitle, The Work of Recognition, is not an accidental title. I'm particularly interested in the way in which we understand work as the foundation of empathic and solidaristic understandings of human activity. But perhaps a little bit more of that later. So, thus far, a health warning about the language of empathy. It sounds obvious that we should be more ethically disposed to one another, more responsible towards one another, the more we are aware of their experience. And that is not entirely wrong. But that awareness is not simply an identification which reduces the opacity, to use Jameson's word, of the other, into what I can cope with, absorbs it into my narrative, as I said earlier. That awareness of the other's suffering is a willingness to work at understanding, to work at how in language we shape ways of talking together and thus of acting together in the face of loss, tragedy, and atrocity. Empathy, in other words, becomes something which demands to be fleshed out in particular kinds of long-term, patient, epistemically humble responses to the sufferings of others, rather than the naive and, I think, deeply misleading sense that all we need to know is how someone is feeling. Now, that leads me on to a few thoughts about one of the most interesting 20th century writers on the subject of empathy, Edith Stein, a pupil of Edmund Husserl, one of the very few women to study philosophy and indeed gain a doctorate in philosophy in pre-war Germany. And the doctoral thesis in question was precisely on the concept of empathy. Published, if I remember rightly, in 1916. It's a very brief work, but one which in all kinds of ways anticipates developments within continental phenomenology going up to the 1950s. Anyone who has read Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception and turns to Stein's concept of empathy will perhaps be surprised to discover just how much there is in Stein, upon which Merleau-Ponty subsequently builds. And Stein was also largely responsible for the publication of Husserl's own later works with extensive editing from her own hand. Some of you may know her later history, which is a rather extraordinary one, that having been brought up in a not very observant Jewish family, she converted to Catholicism in the 1920s, became a Carmelite nun in an enclosed convent, continued to write on theology and philosophy, and eventually died in Auschwitz. She's now a saint of the Catholic Church. But being a saint of the Catholic Church doesn't automatically preclude you from being a very good philosopher. And there's no doubt that that is exactly what she was. So, in her work on the concept of empathy, what is she proposing as central to the empathic awareness? The curious and interesting thing about this is that she doesn't begin by thinking about our identification with the feeling of the other in the conventional Baron Cohenish kind of way. She speaks about the empathic more broadly as the way in which our own sense of self, our own sense of ourselves as speaking subjects, our own sense of ourselves as embodied subjects, is inextricably bound up with the imaginative awareness of a perspective that is not ours. I cannot, she says, even construct the notion of my body without imagining a consciousness that is not mine. My consciousness is incapable of registering the back of my head as an object. My body is not an object to my consciousness. It's not a thing in the world. And so, to construct the very idea of a bodily subject, I must imagine what she calls a 0 point of orientation, a perspectival point that is not my own, or rather, an entire global system of perspectival points, not my own. I have, to pursue it a little further, I have to learn how to speak by being spoken to. I have to learn how to relate by being related to. And, ultimately, I have to learn how to know, I have to learn how to learn by being known, being learned by another. Being, to pick up a helpful phrase of Stanley Cavell's, being read by another. Cavell speaks about human interaction as reading and being read. And for Stein, that is how we become linguistic subjects, conscious subjects, by that unexpected, complex, elusive process of somehow learning to construct the perspective that is not my own. My consciousness, my spirit, my soul, and Stein at this point is feeling her way for the terminology, is a social construct. Not in the sense that it's something society imposes on a rebellious, long-suffering and rather resentful individual ego, but that the very sense of being a point of orientation is necessarily socially built, socially constructed. So, for Stein, the empathic perspective begins when I see that I am seen, or know that I am known. And that fundamental recognition is how I begin to see myself as belonging in a world not only of material objects to be negotiated, but more crucially, more problematically, a world of alien motivation and volition, which yet somehow makes partial sense. Stein, in these and in other ways, is, I think, very strongly underlining the significance of not an ideal of transparency to others or a transparency of others, but an ideal of ongoing conceptual relational labour. And that sense of being sceptical about the idea of being transparent to one another, that runs not only through phenomenological discussion in the 20th century, it also surfaces in the work of some of the disciples of Wittgenstein, from Stanley Cavell to Dewey Phillips. Stanley Cavell's extraordinarily powerful philosophical work returned repeatedly to the toxic effect of supposing that an other ought to be transparent to me, and that if that transparency fails, there is nothing I can trust. What if, says Cavell in effect, what if the task is to continue, as Aruna de Souza suggests, to continue to work at the good enough solidarity, which allows enough mutuality at this point to move on to another level, and unfolds and reflects on itself in a kind of feedback loop as time continues. Now, I find that Stein's general approach, and there's a lot more that could be said about it, Stein's general approach is a helpful corrective to the oversimplifications that I began with. Rather than saying the ideal communicative situation is one in which the experience of another is felt by me without remainder as it's felt by them, we are brought back to this theme of opacity. Instead of the ideal being, I know how you feel, the appropriate response is, I have no idea how you feel. And that second response may be the one that actually releases the possibility of understanding and conversation at another level. Another philosopher, happily still very much with us, who has explored these themes is Ray Langton of Cambridge, who has written very provocatively and I think very helpfully about empathy as, rather paradoxically, something which reinforces for us a sense of our contingency. Rather than empathy being the way in which I absorb all possible emotional experience into my own story, empathy is far more the awareness that my story is not the only story that could be told. In a Steinian kind of framework, that recognition that mine is not the only story to be told becomes, both in Langton and in Stein, one of the foundations of a more acute, a more durable sense of how the empathic can work ethically. Because if the analysis offered by Stein and in different vocabulary by Langton is indeed accurate, then what we come back to is essentially the notion that we as consciousnesses are constantly readjusting to the intractable and impenetrable reality of other consciousnesses which are not going to be reduced to our terms. To recognize that irreducible otherness is not simply a theoretically desirable outcome, it is arguably the foundation of any durable, active and creative social philosophy. If our problem in societies is constantly to suppose that where we really need to get is a mutual transparency which leaves no opacity, no difference, we are on the way to, at best, a highly unintelligent society, at worst, a society in which conflict becomes absolute because of the expectation that harmony ought to be absolute. And that's not a million miles away from where we are in many parts, I would say, of the North Atlantic so-called civilization right at the moment. That is perhaps something we could talk about a little further later on. Now, I included this discussion about empathy in a book on the subject of solidarity, partly because it seemed to me that in some of the work I was looking at, I'm sorry to keep on mentioning Baron Cohen, but he's a helpful Aunt Sally for these purposes. Some of the work I was looking at, it appeared to me that notions of empathy, rather uncritical notions of empathy, were being made to do the work that ought to be done by solidarity. Back to that little book by Aruna de Souza that I quoted from, where she speaks of the need for a solidarity that recognizes its own limitation. Not a solidarity of total uncritical identity, but a solidarity which negotiates between persons, between agents, how they can work together. Stein, of course, goes further, and I would say deeper than that. She wants us to think not only about helpful programs for society, but finally about metaphysics. She wants us to think of the self itself as empathically constructed in this process of reading and being read, this process of seeing and being seen. And others don't go quite as far as that. But it seemed to me, in reflecting on the connection between these two notions of empathy and solidarity, that to understand a little bit how there's movement between them, it helps to remember that solidarity, as that notion has developed in the last century and a half and more, solidarity is frequently presented both as a prior fact about social agents or subjects and as an ideal to be striven for. We are, as a matter of fact, bound up with the consciousnesses of others, and as a matter of desire and imperative, we are summoned to live in such a way that that interdependence is fleshed out and followed through day by day in our actual decisions and our actual relationships. So it may help to think of solidarity itself, as I argue in the book, as one of the foundational facts about being human. We are caught up in connections we have not in fact created and may not fully understand. In order to connect with those connections in a fresh and life-giving way, we will need to cultivate certain virtues for which empathy is not a bad shorthand. Assuming, that is, that we're not expecting too much of it, that we're not mythologizing it, or making it do work for which it's not equipped. Which means, I would argue, that it's perfectly proper to ask what the place is of empathy in our programs of moral or spiritual education. Perfectly proper to say that, with a strong injection of Edith Stein here, one of the things we ought to be learning in any educational process worth the name is something about the opacity of embodied persons to one another. When that sense of the irreducible otherness of the other comes through in any educative process, we are one step away from the profoundly risky myth that somewhere there is an ideal mutual transparency which we ought to be aiming at, so that we have failed radically if we fail to realize or instantiate that. The very idea, I'm going back here to Stein, the very idea of an other whose gestural and verbal behavior is the tangible shape of what we know as purpose and desire. That is not only part of what it is to live in a society, a community that takes otherness seriously. It's to recognize that the very fact of purpose and desire destabilizes any understanding of the other. I do not know what another wants, any more than I know what an other feels. The very idea of an other ought to tell me that. And that is not some kind of failure or disaster. Another Wittgensteinian philosopher, the late Dewi Phillips of Swansea, was fond of saying that it was not good enough to think that language stood between me and the other person. Language is my connection with another's subjectivity. That's the way they are present. And to imagine that there is somehow a way around that, where I'm aware, ahistorically, almost impersonally, of another, that won't do. So, if we are looking to what it is that nourishes and sustains something like an ethical society, we do, as I've argued at some length in this book, we do need a robust notion of solidarity as somehow a given in our experience. We need to demythologize that all too familiar subject of a great deal of religion and philosophy in the Western world, the ready-made, self-sufficient ego with its given desires, gifts, and so forth. And we need to go back to the notion of selfhood as constructed, socially shaped, bound up with that consciousness of, or imagination of, the perspective that is not ours. In refining and deepening that awareness, we turn to both the sciences and the arts. It's quite right to say that the importance of the humanities in education, and I'm not holding my breath that anybody in authority is going to listen to this these days, the importance of the humanities in education has something to do with all this. Something to do with the opacity of people to one another. The importance of the sciences in mapping some of the neurological background of different ways of knowing is crucial here. And there are intriguing and, I could say, very creative and very significant essays in just that around in some quantity at present. But if the analysis I've sketched is anything like right, then what the humanities do is, so to speak, to build on that phrase which St. Augustine so memorably uses in his Confessions. I have become a question to myself. I have become a question to myself as the other is a question to me and I am a question to them. Opacity. Reading and being read. Because apart from reading the instructions on a packet of fast-cooked rice, reading is not something you do just once. You reread and are reread. When you have read another, you read back to them what you have read, and they will read it to you and read you in the process. All of that is going on in every conversation. And the result of ignoring all of that is not only a society of committed individualists, but a society where there remains no sense of what some philosophers have called hesitation on the threshold of the other's strangeness. If there are no real strangers, what kind of society is that? Well, there's a good deal more that I would love to discuss in this connection. But in the last few minutes, let me just both sum up what I've been trying to say so far and push out a few more thoughts in the direction of where the book is, I hope, travelling. Basic to what I've said is the warning against idealizing and mythologizing the idea of empathy, treating it as essentially something to do with a transparency of the other's subjectivity to mine, which allows me not only to know what they're feeling, but also to respond appropriately to it, appropriately, nurturingly, affirmingly, kindly. But, as I said, it's perfectly clear that there are people who know very well, all too well, what the effect of their action is in terms of cruelty and atrocity, and do it all the same. And more deeply, the question remains of what I'm saying about myself and the other if I'm assuming that the other is always capable of being absorbed and assimilated. Secondly, moving from there to Edith Stein's work, I was proposing that we take seriously her notion of redefining empathy in terms of that basic, not quite primordial, I think she calls it unhelpfully at one point, secondarily primordial, but that basic awareness of other awarenesses. I'm aware of being the object of awareness. And in that, my whole notion of ego and body takes shape. And that allows us to take seriously the impenetrability of otherness, but also the continuing possibility of relation and conversation. And if so, then of labour, of shared work. And I turn very briefly, in conclusion, to one last philosopher of the last century who wrote briefly but very pungently about the subject of solidarity. This is the Polish philosopher Józef Tischner, who was very active in the Solidarność movement in Poland in the 1980s, very close indeed to the labour unions that composed the Solidarność movement. He was also a Catholic priest and a trained philosopher who, intriguingly, shared some of his major influences with Edith Stein herself. Some of those who had taught or worked with Stein also taught Tischner. And Tischner, in his reflections on solidarity, has a couple of things to say which are well worth pondering. For one thing, he says we need to work at the construction of what he calls a solidarity without enemies. That is a sense of interdependence that is different from the common sentiment of like-minded persons, or persons of the same ethnic group, or persons of the same religion, or whatever. An interdependent solidarity doesn't require that there be an other against whom you define yourself. Therefore, if we are looking for a solidarity without enemies, we have to understand that the solidarity we work with is, yes, a given about our human nature, but not to be identified simply with the sameness of an ethnic or social or religious group. Second interesting formulation he comes up with is that work is always a form of conversation. In order to work effectively, you need to know how to talk and to listen. You need precisely to be open to the reading and being read that we've reflected on. Unless work is simply what some external authority mandates for a homogeneous and undifferentiated group, then you're in the business of listening, learning, negotiating with the language, the action, the techne in the Greek sense, the actual intelligible labour that they are performing so that you may adjust to it and they to you. And the third interesting element in Tischner's presentation is that he defines solidarity as ultimately something which is sustained by what he calls faithfulness. Work that is conversational, work that has this eristic, mutual character, questioning, responding, finding common forms of action, that both depends on and creates a sense of fidelity to one another. You know you can trust the person you're working with. And you can't, he says to his audiences of trade unionists in Krakow in 1980, you can't work in any meaningful sense with someone unless you have built and go on building that sense of mutual fidelity. One of the things that he has to say about the last days of the communist regime in Poland is that it has successfully created a social order in which fidelity, trustworthiness no longer have any significance for the mass of the population. No one trusts that government is conducted in their interest. And that creates a toxic, destructive, acidic effect in society at large. Now, I would say that Tishner's reflections on the nature of solidarity are indeed a perspective building on some of the insights I've suggested that we find in somebody like Edith Stein and other writers I could mention in this connection. Tishner is very definitely committed to the opacity of the other. When I'm working alongside somebody else, I don't automatically know what they're feeling, or seeing, or thinking, but I can talk to them. And if I want to work effectively, that's what I must do. And that deep sense of the imperative to look for a solidarity without enemies is, again, entirely in tune with the kind of perspective that Stein brings, which is, in the very simplest sense, if I never quite know what other perspective I need in order to know myself better, then I am the poorer for it. In other words, if I begin by saying, that perspective, that kind of other, that kind of stranger has nothing to say to me, then I may be cutting myself off from crucial forms of learning. Thus far Stein. And Tishner goes further by saying, authentic dialogue begins when you know that the other knows something you need to know, even if you don't know what that is, and neither do they. Dialogue is the process of discovering what it is that gives life to you in an encounter with what you don't control. And just to come back to where we started, perhaps the problem of what I've called reductive and sentimentalized views of empathy is that sense of the need for the perspective that you don't control is being eroded. There is indeed an ideal transparency. There is indeed an ideal form of identification with the other. And the failure of that becomes a deep failure in social cohesion, social intelligibility. But what if, Aruna de Souza again, what if we need to adjust our expectation to what I called earlier the good enough solidarity? Not in a sense of settling for second best, but in a sense of realistically acknowledging that in a properly human encounter, at least two ignorant people are accepting the need to learn what they don't already know from someone who they are not. And in that creative opacity, that productive mysteriousness of subject to subject, speaker to speaker, lies the ground of a more healthy and a more durable ethical perspective in human community. Thank you for listening patiently.
Well, thank you very much, Rowan, for that. It's a great luxury to have a choice of so many different questions which I might ask you, but I promise to stick to three. So let's start with this one. You made the case at the beginning of your talk eloquently that empathy might underlie acts of cruelty just as much as it underlies acts of kindness. In defense of the claim that empathy is more tightly related to morality than you say, What about the idea that people who are cruel have a kind of temporary or instantaneous ability to intuit what the other will suffer, but real empathy is more about a longer-term relationship?
Yes, that's a very fair question, I think, because to cast it in those terms is, I think, already to say that the longer-term perspective, with the learning that entails, is a very different matter. I'd still say there are those who seem to make a career out of cruel empathy, negative empathy. With, I think this happens, doesn't it, in certain kinds of very toxic relationships. Somebody knows where the raw points are in the other. Collapsing marriages and other relationships, destructive parenting, very often in people's accounts of these, in memoirs and so forth, you come back to that sense of someone knowing, perhaps not even consciously, where the raw flesh is to scrape at. And that continues. Mm-hmm. The difference, I think you're pointing us to, is that there then is a kind of empathic accompaniment, which is willing to take the time to learn not just how it feels, but to engage with that feeling.
Yes.
In a different way.
So your thought is that cruelty can just be just as well exemplified in a long-term relationship as in a...
Yeah. Yes.
All right. So two concepts that loom large in your talk are opacity and work. And so I was wondering whether our opacity to one another is something that you think is inevitable, or which it's good to maintain, or whether it's just something which needs to be earned but also overcome.
The obvious answer for me to say, I have no idea what you're asking. Opacity is not clearly a bad thing. We treat it, I think, in creative conversation, not as some kind of accidental obstacle which has to be overcome, but as a shifting element of a kind of almost a third element of, I'm tempted to say inexhaustibility, but that's a bit theological. Do you know what I mean? What we can't ever quite get our minds around. And we think we've got it, and then something else arises, and the feedback loop comes into play. I get a response, I think about that response, I'm enabled by that response to engage in a different and a new way with someone. And then I come up against another kind of difficulty. And that is how we learn one another. It's an asymptotic thing. It doesn't, we never get to that total transparency. We can, though, I think, do two things. One is to recognize those forms of opacity which are seriously derailing or dehumanizing a relationship, and work at that. And also we can, I think, simply appreciate and understand that the very process of language is the generation of new problems between us, and that's fine.
Yes, thank you. Okay, last question. You used this very resonant phrase, hesitation on the threshold. Might one say that, and as it were making a virtue of our strangeness to one another, might one not say that in a world of displaced persons and refugee crises, there are too many strangers? We need to stop being such strangers to each other?
Well, it's what kind of strangers we are to each other. Mm-hmm. There's a stranger onto whom I project the notion that there's nothing in common. These are people from an alien moral world. I don't know how to talk to them. Mm. And that's the kind of stranger language we really need to keep an eye out for. Mm. And it's around us very liberally these days. Mm. That a person from another culture, another religious background, is almost automatically somebody whose values are not really going to be recognizable to me. I know that in advance. I know that those people are terrorists, child abusers, whatever. I know that. Just look at them. You know where they come from. And they come from cultures where all that is normal. Cultures where, everybody slaughters innocent people and abuses children all the time. And that, how do we talk to those people? We just keep them at arm's length. The real positive response to the stranger, I think, is to say, well, tell me what it is like, because I don't know. I have not been on a raft in the North Sea. I have not had to snatch up a bundle of belongings to cross from eastern Ukraine to western Ukraine. I have not seen my family destroyed by a bomb in Gaza. I don't know. Help me know, because then we can relate more fully. And that recognition of strangeness, that's the hesitation, I mean. Knowing that I don't know, knowing what I don't know about the other. And I worry about so much of certain bits of our political rhetoric, that kind of, what I like to call the density, the dimensionality of the stranger vanishes in the mythology.
Yes.
And that, that's not immediately to offer any solutions to practical issues around migration levels and asylum laws, but it is to say that if we approach those questions and that lawmaking process on the basis that the stranger is the incomprehensible other, we're doing more than hesitating on the threshold. We're slamming the door, really.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for those answers. Now it's over to you. There is a roving mic. Right at the back, please, just by the... all right. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I agree with you that transparency is an unrealistic ideal, but I wonder whether the contrast, the binary presentation of transparency and opacity is maybe a false dichotomy, because it seems to me that there can be degrees of knowledge, or a comparison at least of how much we can know someone else and how they're feeling. The way this is usually spoken about is in relation to shared experiences. And the first thought that comes into my head is addiction and alcoholism. The reason why Alcoholics Anonymous works so well is that there's a group of people who have a shared experience of something, and you could say that in those circumstances, an alcoholic would know more what it's like to be in that situation than someone else. So even though they don't know exactly what it's like to be in your position, and then that would be transparency, and that isn't possible, they know slightly more than, say, someone who hasn't had experiences of alcoholism. So I wondered what your response to that would be.
My response is very enthusiastic. I think that really does hit the nail on the head. And back to what I was saying in response to the question just now, yes, of course, we look for those forms of opacity that are somehow hindering or limiting the process of understanding and growing together. So opacity is a moving target. It's not, we never know anything, but it's fair enough to say we never know everything. But you make a very important point. The addiction instance is an extremely good one, if I may say so, because I think it's exactly that which makes the AA support group or whatever a place where perhaps there is a way in which someone can say to another, I know what you mean, where narratives can emerge which, if you like, reinforce for someone that it is all right to tell that story because others have been there or others have shared something of it. And I think that's massively important. I connect that a little bit with the discussion in the book of the idea of the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, of the solidarity of the shaken, where he talks about the experience for some people emerging from the First World War of a kind of empathic identification across boundaries because of the horror and the loss and the catastrophic nature of the experience in the trenches. And he says the trenches are, if you like, the seedbed of a very different kind of solidarity from what we've known before, because people on the opposite sides of the barbed wire are sharing very deeply in something, with a kind of gravity and intensity that perhaps Europe hasn't known for a while. So, yeah.
Okay, let's see your hands again. Come forward a couple of rows on that side. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. I was wondering through your talk when you were going to start criticizing psychological jargon, and you never did. You know, I kept on expecting you to use the word narcissism, for example, and you never did. And because in my mind, there's this sort of funny thing going on, which in the attempt to understand each other more, we're coming up with all of these categories that seek to more and more comprehensively describe and define the subjective experience of other people. And it's not only a desire to label and categorize others' experience, it's also, it seems to be largely on the other side too, that we want to be told what our experience is. And yet that also seems to be really in contradiction to this idea of opacity or hesitation at the threshold. And I just wondered what your thoughts were.
No, thank you very much. No, I would willingly talk further about, what could you call it? Almost the pseudo-professionalism of naming certain conditions too rapidly. I can give you a diagnosis, you can call it this. That is one of those things you can describe as a good servant and a bad master, isn't it? It can serve, it can allow somebody to say, oh, it's a relief to know that there is a name for what I'm suffering. I'm not just, in a vacuum. Equally, if someone, psychiatrist or counsellor or whoever, goes on to say, and people like you usually do this or think this or feel this, that's the point at which you might want to say, hang on, we actually need to do a bit more work. We need the AA group, we need the conversation to move somewhere else. And it's, again, not unrelated to a point which I remember being made more than once when I was still working in Cambridge and was part of the university's working group on student mental health. And Dame Carol Black, who was then principal of Newnham, who had, of course, a formidable professional medical career behind her, saying we have to be very careful about a sort of false medicalizing of mental health issues, which treats them as having the same kind of block identity as physical health issues. It's not so simple. Now, I'm not against looking for intelligent taxonomies of mental ill health. I am very wary, from quite a few examples I've seen, of people using that uncritically as a shortcut, as almost a sop to that desire to have the map quartered and lined properly. So take the point, I think.
There was another one on the roughly same latitude. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the riveting talk. I wanted to ask something about the terminology, because, at least in my view, if we maybe have to shift from criticizing this use of empathy so that we think we know, so that compassion, immediatimation is only to a certain degree possible maybe, ought we maybe to shift on talking about humility and about, I would call it, a virginal gaze on reality, on the other, than more criticizing the nowadays use of empathy. What were your thoughts maybe on how ought we to use empathy even as a term? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. And I would connect it with a rather different part of my mental map, which is where I've worked a bit recently on some of the psychological categories used in early Greek Christian writing about prayer and contemplation. You mentioned the virginal gaze, and in the work of Evagrius around the year 400. There's the distinction drawn between looking at things in a diabolical way and looking at things in an angelic way. The diabolical way of looking at things is to ask, first and foremost, the question, what's this got for me? The angelic way is to say, what is this in itself? What is it as part of God's creation? And I suspect you're kind of working towards something not unlike that kind of disjunction. So yes, the terminology is maddeningly difficult. I found when I was first trying to write about empathy that nearly everybody I was reading was using it in a different way. And after a bit, I at least found what I thought I couldn't believe it meant, and started out from there. How it relates to words like compassion. It's interesting, etymologically, they're not particularly different. But there is often, I think, in the word compassion, some sense of a continuing otherness, which maybe is not quite there in empathy or even sympathy. And there's another question, how you distinguish empathy from sympathy, but don't get me started, that keeps you here all night. So yes, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it, because essentially what you are looking for, what I'm looking for in this, is what helps us step back so as to see more clearly in order to engage more truthfully. Not to step back in detachment in the wrong sense, flight from encounter, but to say, how do I engage with my intelligence, my emotional and intellectual intelligence, with what I know I cannot fully compass or control. And that's where the gaze, I think, comes in.
Okay, let's move. So just, yes, why not?
I think we're creeping
We're doing it geographically this evening. We'll get to you in the end.
Hello, yeah, so you've talked about empathy being as trying to understand one's feelings, and it's often regarded as being an emotion, one of fundamental emotions of human psychology. And then there's this whole debate about empathy being regarded as an emotion or a virtue. So I was just wondering, what is your opinion on empathy being regarded as a moral virtue?
I want to hold on to the idea that in some sense we can talk about empathy as virtue, as we can talk about solidarity as virtue. But as with the word solidarity, we do that out of a recognition that underneath there are connections we need to be plugged into more fully in that. Empathy as emotion, yes. I know, I think, what that's about in the literature, because we can quite rightly talk about an emotional response to another's suffering, the wince that we experience when we see somebody else cutting a finger. Yes, at that level, yes, if you want to talk about empathic feeling, you can, because that's precisely, as there is somebody experiencing something which, if I were experiencing, I would be shuddering. But that's very much a baseline. We move on from there to that more critical, more linguistically embedded labour of understanding what the story is of which this is a part, and how that perspective from which I am seen is being formed.
Okay, let's get some people nearer the front in.
Thank you for sharing this perspective. I was wondering, because you mentioned it's very important to know that I don't know about your perspective as a concept of empathy, but I feel like in human psychology, this openness can't go on forever. At some point, you have to make a judgment, and this judgment can have two results. One is you understand it and produce something that's beneficial to the other party, or you make a judgment in good faith, but it produces like kind of an adverse effect for the other person based on your misunderstanding of like what their situation really are. So would you say that the process of trying to understand it and trying to make a good judgment of it is already a good moral stance, or is or is like fundamentally providing a good solution to it is like being a moral stance?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. I think I would say that, yes, of course, there's a point at which judgment has to be made. I'm not saying we just stand there gaping wonderingly at the mystery of the other. Even in human intimacy with the people we love most, we don't just stand there amazed at how wonderful they are. At some point, somebody's got to take the bins out. But in a more ordinary, more kind of prosaic environment of trying to sense, to imagine another situation, it is also because you need to know what the appropriate response is. You will have to make a judgment. And to pick up the language of another writer I touch on in the book, the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis in 1945. Bonhoeffer talks about all of this in terms of our responsibility for the other, meaning our readiness to act for their good. So we, yes, as you say, we spend some time refining, developing our understanding so that when we act, we may act intelligently, not stupidly, creatively, not destructively. And when we get that wrong, as we inevitably will, we go back to the humility mentioned earlier and say, I'm learning, and I'm learning about the process of learning all the time. So, yeah.
Now your neighbour, yes.
Thank you. So from what I understand, you defend that chasing this empathy, idea of reaching reaching activity would be almost a futile race towards finding empathy. Do you think that these concepts of transparency and opacity apply to our perception of ourselves, and would striving for transparency of ourselves to us be as futile as doing it to others? What do you think about this in that direction?
Thank you. And yes, that's a really good question, and something which, again, I touch on a little bit, discussing Edith Stein, because she does, in fact, pick up exactly this, and talks about the sense in which we have to recognize opacity within ourselves, that we will never construct a final model of ourselves, but at the same time it's important, really your question at the back, it's important that we identify those opacities that are damaging. In Shakespeare's King Lear, you remember, after Lear has stormed off stage, having banished Cordelia, Regan and Goneril, the sort of rational minds in the scene, kind of glide together on opposite sides of the stage and say, well, now we see what's going on. And I think it's Regan says, he hath ever but slenderly known himself. And very interestingly, what she's doing is nailing Lear's tantrum against Cordelia to his own lack of self-knowledge. That he doesn't know himself means he doesn't know how deeply he needs uncritical, adoring affirmation. And because he doesn't know that, he doesn't know how to relate to the actual vulnerability and changeability of human relation as it really is. Cordelia's famous remark in her speech to Lear, why have my sisters husbands if they love you all? They can't be speaking the truth, and you must know they're not speaking the truth. So what the hell is going on? Is Cordelia's question. So to know oneself in that sense, to know what it is that's getting in the way of just, reasonable, compassionate exchange, that matters, I think. That matters.
Okay, more hands, please. Yes, come forward one row.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. My question, I guess, builds on the ones before, but first, I want to sort of say thank you for the longevity of your work, because I saw a YouTube video of a lecture you gave probably a decade ago while I was studying, and you were talking about love and empathy, and you spoke about Edith Stein, and that set me on a journey of exploration into her work in phenomenology, which massively sort of affected how I think about things. And one of the things that I noticed as I was thinking about it was that a lot of the words that we use to talk about this way of interacting with each other, so like respect, relation, recognition, these are all constructed with re and then sort of a verb, so like respect, to look again, relation, to tie again. And so within the language we use to try and articulate how we have this interaction, you have that need, repetition, and constant enduring activity. But in a world that increasingly looks like people are not willing to sit in an enduring state, and the desire for a sort of a pseudo certainty, what can we do? Is there more that we can do than just listening to people to try to help other people be comfortable in that uncomfortableness?
Is there more we can do than bang our heads against the wall as we read the papers or watch the news feed? Yeah. And this is where I do keep coming back to what we think about education and what it does and doesn't set out to do, and how we begin to educate our own students, our own younger generation, into the time taking that you've suggested, because we're more and more in a really disturbingly short-termist environment, whether it's politics or the however many characters it is on screen. We increasingly privilege that brief, instantly graspable moment. And if I had dictatorial powers over education, I'd say I would quite like to insist on a weekly slow afternoon or something like that, where students were not expected to solve problems within a particular period, but were encouraged to take the time to understand why a problem was not solvable in half an hour or 20 minutes or 10 minutes. And I don't know how exactly you do that, but it's one of the things I would quite like to see explored, because we more and more buy into the idea that education is about arriving at a sufficiently crisp and efficient habit of problem solving to guarantee us employment. End of. And subjects that take time are, like philosophy, are not privileged in our educational world, to put it mildly. The paradox is, of course, that the sciences, when they're doing their job, are time-taking and time-wasting to a degree we can barely imagine. How much frustrated time goes into a viable solution, a viable experimental resolution? Enormous amount. Learning about learning. And yet we behave as if solutions to scientific problems were always like solutions to mathematical problems. That is, the answers contained in the question. Shift the pieces around and you know. But it's not so self-contained as that. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm ranting, but it is one of the things I think we ought to be thinking very seriously about. What do we expect of an educational process?
Good, let's go over here and then we'll give that side a turn.
When you spoke about the necessity to understand that we are contingent beings in the sort of role to understand one another, I was reminded of the part in the City of God where Augustine talks about the same need to understand we are contingent to understand God. And I was wondering if you think there is a value in empathy, and especially with the criteria of empathy that you spoke about, in understanding God, and whether this same need for empathy, especially sort of looking at him trying to send his son so we can achieve salvation, is possible with a necessary being and not just with other contingent beings.
Well, mentioning St. Augustine is a short way to my heart, so we'll start with that. But I think that, to shift to theology for a moment, the point that all that traditional language about God as a necessary being is trying to make is simply to say God is not at the mercy of circumstance. And we are. That's the key difference. God is not at the mercy of circumstance, and therefore God's fidelity to creation and God's love of creation is not vulnerable to the fact that you and I make such a pig's ear of it. Meanwhile, my relation to you, anybody else in this room, is contingent in the sense that I'm not in control of things. I am at the mercy of circumstances. What you say and do will impact on me. I'd better learn how to cope with that, and vice versa. So it's really something to do with, sorry for non-theologians and non-believers in the audience, but within the discourse, it's something to do with how you understand the love of God as more than just God feeling very warm towards us, especially when we're nice to him. And sadly, an awful lot of religion does go down that rabbit hole. But I have to think more about that.
I think it's something we're all trapped in the sense that we live in a society where you have to look after yourself. You're protected by your family when you're young. You're taught to share with your siblings, but then when you grow up, you have to fight for yourself, and you have to make sure that you've got enough to look after yourself before you look after other people. So do those sort of cultural messages have something to do with the fact that you can't just talk about sharing? If you get the sharing right, in terms of not thinking you know everything about somebody else, realizing that you don't know each other, but are there other factors as well?
Whenever I hear myself beginning a sentence with, we live in a society where ... I think, yeah. It's a complicated question you're asking, really, because quite clearly, and again, there's a little bit about this in the book, quite clearly, the idea that I have no claim and must simply roll over in front of the other is not what this is about. And the late, great Gillian Rose, one of my greatest philosophical mentors and friends, was constantly saying that kind of abjection in front of the other or the stranger is not what this means. What she says, and I love the formulation, is wisdom begins when you realize that the other is invested in their life as you are in yours. So disinvesting from my life on behalf of the other is not the answer here. It's grasping that we both have an investment in a future, and that needs to be addressed together rather than separately. Not simply flinging down the boundaries and barriers, but finding the intelligence to move deeper into it. Something like that, anyway, I think.
Anybody else over on this side of the room? Just to give you fair shares? No? So perhaps this on this side? Yes, halfway back.
It's
question has only just occurred to me, so it might not be a very lucid one, but could you say something about the value of trying to understand different types of people? Because I've been thinking, as you've been talking, that I don't understand my own family at all, and they're all a complete mystery to me. And not because they're sort of extraordinary people in one sense, but they seem so inaccessible to me. And how much time should we spend trying to understand the people closest to us versus people who might be very different to us, who have very different social and cultural coordinates to us, for instance?
That's a new question, I must say. Well, I don't know. Actually, I hadn't thought about it. I must think about it. But if I were thinking out loud just for a moment, I'd say there are, of course, very different ways of knowing or understanding involved here. You may live with someone, you may live in a family where, yes, you recognize they're constantly surprising you. They're not kind of acting out a plain script, a single plain script. And you adjust to that. You expect the unexpected. You habituate yourself in some way to that. And I think one of the real problems in some relationships is where one partner insists on saying, yes, but why? Yes, but why? And digging more and more deeply. I want to understand why you're saying that, which kind of freezes the relationship very often, in my experience. And something similar, I guess, with trying to understand the stranger. You don't seek to understand so that at some point you can say definitively, right, I now know how it's all going to work and how you're going to behave. You get to the point where you can, as I put it, intelligently adjust as time goes on. And you do it not as a pursuit in itself, but as part of what, well, very simple terms, what makes things work. The conversation of work again.
Thank you. Yes, good.
Hi, I want to put an idea to you of Lucy O'Brien's. I don't think she's in the room, but I apologise to her if she is. So there's a line of thought in Lucy's work that she takes from Sebastian Gardner, which he takes from Sartre, which is this idea of this deep paradox that Gardner thinks is in Sartre to do with the paradox of intersubjectivity. And I take it that the reading is that this kind of idea in Stein about us like coming to see ourselves in relation to the other and building up a kind of intersubjectivity through that process, like, is inherently paradoxical if we think about it at the level of an intellectual cognitive achievement. That it can't be whatever it is. The work can't involve something like imaginative projection, because you can't literally imagine the perspective of another and inhabit it. And so Lucy takes the solution to this problem to be precisely the self-conscious emotions of which empathy is a member, but also shame and embarrassment and these, that they give you a way out of the paradox, because what they give us is a direct, felt, effective access to the other that is the basis on which we can bootstrap the entire process. And that without that, if we only had intellectual resources, it wouldn't even make sense to begin to understand the other. Does that question make sense? I wonder what you think.
I think so, yes. And again, it's one we could spend a lot of time on. I think up to a point I'd go along with that, because I don't think that the imagining of the other perspective is, if you like, the conscious creation of a picture of how it works, but something probably much more connected with exactly that emotional bundle you talk about. We cannot but somehow affectively connect behaviors in relation to our behaviors, some of these ways. So I think there's something there. I'd need a bit more time to tease it out, but I think there's meat there.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time. My apologies to those of you who had questions and which we haven't been able to fit in. Thanks very much to those of you who did ask your questions. And Rowan, thank you so much for a fascinating talk.